Hello again, everybody. Welcome to a new week. Welcome to a new chapter in Psych 1. This chapter happens to be personality. And in the personality chapter, we have technically three parts. I'm going to break it into two, I think. I'm going to go with our man Freud, and then we will talk about the other three types of personality theories, being humanistic and trait theories, which was part of that cognitive revolution that we talked about way at the beginning of this semester in the overview. That cognitive revolution that brought back the idea of um, thoughts and emotions being just as important as behavior. And then we will talk about trait theories, which is sort of along the lines of that personality test that you guys are going to be taking for um, online, the Big Five, and social cognitive, which talks about the mixture of your personality traits and the situation itself that determines how you're going to act. But for today, for now, this lecture specifically, let's talk some Freud. Um, Earlier in um, at the very beginning of the semester, much earlier, weeks ago, um, we talked about the different sort of founding subfields or subtopics of psychology, and one of the big one was psychodynamic theories, as you see up top. And we talked about a guy named Sigmund Freud who had a lot of interesting things to write and say about psychology. He really was the father of modern, what we would say, clinical psychology, because he was really the first person to bring up the idea and run with the idea that mental health is separate from physical health. As we'll talk about in the last chapter next week, um, people, doctors, before Freud's time, if you had depressive symptoms or mental problems without any physical problems, a doctor would just laugh you out of the office and say, get out. So Freud was the first one to bring it to the forefront. But the ways that he went about it and the theories that he had couldn't actually be scientifically tested, as we'll talk about. So, as I warned you about 13 weeks ago or so, his theories were pretty out there. Um, they did lead to the basis of what we know as clinical psychology today. But let's take a journey through Freud. Before we get there, of course, at the beginning of every chapter, we have an overall definition. So because this chapter is the chapter on personality and personality theories, what do we say personality is? How do we define personality? And the book defines personality as an individual's character list of 15 or 20 adjectives that describe your personality. Who am I? And then there was a little discussion on that. It was one of these little in-class 5-point assignments. But the idea behind this was to think about the things that make you you. So hardworking, lazy, and yes, they could be opposites of each other. There are many times where I'm very lazy. There are many times when I'm very hardworking, trying to make sure I get everything up online for you guys and all of that. So you would have had to make a list. You don't have to do this now, so don't think you do. And just, maybe just think about what makes you you and what makes you guys, what do you guys have in common? What makes you individuals, right? This is all about personality because you're answering the question with this: who am I? What are the traits? What are the qualities? What are the things that make me me? So again, we're going to get more into that portion with your traits in trait theories in the next one, and social cognitive theories, which combine that with the situation. But right now, we're going to focus on Freud. So psychodynamic theories are the Freudian psychology theories that posit that behavior is a dynamic interaction between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And what we've been talking about with unconscious mind and processes implicit things like classical conditioning, and memory and the unconscious implicit parts of learning, right? And things like that. That's not exactly the unconscious mind that Freud thought about. That's a more modern version of that. So we'll get into it. In the next one that I do, humanistic focuses on inner capacities and growth and self-fulfillment. That's where your cognitive revolution came back in. Trait theories are what we just, that exercise that I would have given you in class, where you look at your patterns of behavior and you look at your traits. And then social cognitive theories, as I said, is the interaction between your traits and the situation that you're in. So we'll get to all of these, of course, but today, right now, in this lecture, we're going to focus on that one on the left, psychodynamic theories. So here's our man, Sigmund Freud, who, for the most part, even though his theories are very out there, as we'll discover, even though his findings or the things that he came up with can't really be scientifically tested, yet he's still pretty much the poster child for psychology. And people often wonder why this is, especially since some of his theories are so just outdated and, straight up odd. It's because he was the one that established, as I said, clinical psychology different, or psychology being a mental health idea versus a physical health idea. So where a doctor back in the day would laugh you out of their office, and it would be his office because there weren't female doctors back then in most places, Freud was the first person to observe patients whose disorders did not have a physical explanation. They were feeling anxious, what we now call anxious. They were feeling psychotic. They were feeling depressed. I think back in the day they called it melancholic. So he was the first one to observe patients who did not have any physical symptoms, only mental ones. And he concluded that people's problems came from this interaction where their conscious mind was fighting with their unconscious mind. And what was hidden or trapped in the unconscious mind that couldn't get out revolved around unacceptable thoughts and feelings. And in this case, his version of the unconscious mind was not automatic thinking or things like that. It was about things that were hidden away from the conscious mind because they were too taboo or because they were too unacceptable. Like we couldn't have those in conscious life, so we hid them away. It was almost like, throwing things in the basement that was locked, right? If you ever were a kid and there was like a closet or a basement that was locked up, and you couldn't access it no matter what, you didn't have a key, and it was just in there. You had no idea what was in there, but it might have been bad. That's how Freud sort of talked about the unconscious mind. So today we're going to talk about things like psychoanalysis, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious mind, and what that means, how he got people to sort of bring up what was in their unconscious mind so that he could figure it out even if they couldn't, and his different parts of the mind that sort of fought with one another. And then we'll talk about what he called the the reality principle and the pleasure principle. So before we get to all of these individually, let's talk about how Freud came up with his theories. Freud talked about three different parts of the mind and that they all worked sort of together. The unconscious portion of the mind could not be accessed readily. There is a conscious portion, which is what we would think of as our conscious portion today, what we can think of, what we can interpret, all of those things that we can pull out. And there's the preconscious mind, which is sort of outside of your awareness, but if you really made it conscious, if you made an attempt to think about it, you could pull it out. So just below the surface. The unconscious mind is the one that you can't tap into. So modern day psychologists have looked at Freud's theories, and they have made a really fun kind of analysis. They have used this idea of an iceberg to illustrate Freud's idea that most of what we are dealing with is unconscious, and that's the part that we can't access. So they liken it to as you see on the picture on the right, they liken the mind and the three parts of the mind and the three levels of the mind to an iceberg, because what we see sticking out of the water of an iceberg is only probably about 20 to 25% of the iceberg. The rest of it is lying under the surface. Nobody can see it. If you're in a boat up in the Arctic, you see the iceberg. What you see is only the part that's sticking up out of the water. So there's a whole other part, majority of it, underneath the water. So psychologists have used this idea of an iceberg to illustrate his idea that the mind is mostly hidden beneath the surface. What we have in the conscious part of the brain is still important, but majority of it is hidden under the surface. So these levels, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, are really linked to the three types of mind, or three parts of mind, that sort of interact with each other to make you you. The one that is mostly conscious, as you can see, there's a little bit of it that's in the preconscious, so outside of awareness, but if you needed to make it accessible, you could get there, reach into the drawer and pull something out. The superego, as you can see, which is internalized ideals. And the one that's completely under the surface that you can't touch, completely unconscious, out of the realm of possibility for you to get there, is what he called the id. The id is he basically labeled it your unconscious energy. So we're going to get to what these three are, but I wanted to show you this idea, the structure that Freud thought about for these parts of the mind. So the ego and the superego are mostly conscious, but a little bit preconscious, so we can still get to them just under the surface. And the id is the biggest part of your mind that wants you to do all of the things that you want to do and doesn't care how you do it. That one that drives us is completely unconscious, and we're not really able to access it. So if you note, the id is totally unconscious, but ego and superego operate both on a conscious and unconscious level. However, we can access them even if they are unconscious. But unlike the parts of a frozen iceberg, of course, there's an interaction. And when the interaction isn't good, when it's not, when they're not in line with everybody and they have different ideals, then you have problems. And that's what Freud would say. He would say that it's these three parts of the mind that are not getting along, and it's causing some sort of psychic energy that is causing what we would know as anxiety or depression, or the inability to function properly in your everyday life. So Freud believed that the personality resulted from the interaction of these three systems of the mind. We'll start with the big unconscious one. If I go back really quick, it's the one down here that is all completely under the surface, all completely unconscious. And according to Freud, we have no way of accessing that. That's called the id. The id is the unconscious energy, as you saw from the last slide, where people strive to satisfy their basic needs of survival, which includes violence, anything to survive, right? Kind of like Darwin says, to reproduce and to aggress. So any of your unacceptable behaviors that involve bad behaviors, doing what you need to do to survive, pushing others away, grabbing whatever you need, right? If it makes you happy, or if it allows you to survive, you're going to do it no matter what. The id is going to do it at all costs, not thinking about consequences or anything like that. So sexual behavior, aggressive behavior, anything any bad behavior like stealing or breaking rules is going to be the id, because the id says we want this. We don't care how you get it. We don't care if you steal it. We don't care if you buy it. We just want it. So the id operates on the pleasure principle, and it's going to suggest and work from the perspective of anything that you want that brings you pleasure. Addictions, right, would be the id in control, and all of those things. So whatever it is, right, that's sexual assault. He would say, that it's just the id operating and you just can't stop it. So if the id was able to do that, then this would just be chaos, right? So Freud said, well, there's other parts of the mind that sort of counteract this. So if we skip over the ego for just a second and go to the superego is like the opposite of the id. The superego wants us to be the perfect person, focuses on the ideal behaviors, strives for perfection, acts as a complete moral conscious. Um, in this case, if we're going to cross the street, the id would say, let's cross wherever. And the superego would say, no, no, we need to follow all the rules. We need to be a perfect version of ourselves. We need to cross at the crosswalk, and only when it's green. And in fact, only when the little walk sign is there. So if nobody hits the button and it's green, but there's still a red hand, oh, we can't even cross then, right? It wants to be perfect. So if this sounds kind of familiar that these things are opposites, from Freud's ideas of the id and superego came this sort of rendition in TV shows and cartoons and stuff like that. And if you've ever seen it, and this probably will sound a little familiar to you, the id is kind of like the devil on your shoulder, and the superego is kind of like the angel on your shoulder. So I know growing up, I watched Looney Tunes and a bunch of cartoons, and I watched a few TV shows where somebody was trying to make a decision, and on one shoulder is the devil saying, do it, take however you need to get it, go get it. And there's the angel on the shoulder saying, no, no, if we're going to do this, we have to at least do it the right way. So that would be the modern day sort of ideas of the id and the superego. The id is the devil on your shoulder. The superego is the angel on your shoulder. But there has to be some way to try to get a compromise or a referee between id and superego. And that's where your ego comes in. The ego is the part of the mind on par consciously with the superego that is basically the referee between the two. We can't always do things exactly by the book. We can't do anything that makes us feel pleasure, because most of the time that involves things that are not legal or appropriate in society. So the ego is trying to operate on what we call the reality principle, or what Freud called the reality principle. So the ego seeks to bring realistic gratification for the id's impulses. We obviously all work and no play makes us dull people, but so we have to have some fun, but we have to do it responsibly. So the ego says, look, the id wants to do this and it doesn't sound bad, but we have to do it in a realistic way, right? This is the reality of things. We want long-term pleasure. We want the things that we want. We want stuff. We want music. We want, right, all of these things. But we have to do it in a realistic way. And superego, we don't have to do everything exactly by the book. We don't have to be perfect on everything. If it's 2 o'clock in the morning and there's no traffic, yeah, maybe we can jaywalk a little bit. We're not, we don't have to wait and do everything exactly by the book, but we also can't just go around stealing things. So the ego is trying to satisfy both and sort of play referee. This is where your perceptions, your thoughts, your judgments, and your memories come from, according to Freud. So the ego would be inside your head trying to keep the peace and make a resolution between the angel on your shoulder and the devil on your shoulder. So going back to the iceberg, you can see that the id is all unconscious, so everything that's happening is instinctual, unconscious. We can't access it, and it may be driving us. Freud would say that children are basically all id before that prefrontal cortex is fully functional. That's why kids are always saying, me, 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 I want, and they don't care what the consequence is. They just want that candy bar. They just want those Legos. Or if it's Dr. C, my kiddo, they just want those Pokemon cards, right? Doesn't matter what they have to do to get them. Doesn't matter if they steal them, right? As we get older, we have this superego and the ego that sort of develops in time. But the id is pulling the strings, and we're not able to access it. So looking back, Freud would say that people's personalities come from these psychosexual stages of development. So there are 5 main stages of development, and if for whatever reason your psychic energy remains in any of these ones, then that sort of dictates what your personality traits will be. So what does that mean? Well, let's go through this. The first stage, and you can see this during development, this was a lot of times based on observation of what children do at this stage. And so he came up with these ideas. In the first year and a half of life, the first 18 months, a lot of times, we have children that are putting everything in their mouth, babies sucking on a binky, pacifier or things like that. So the pleasure center, what Freud said, is centers on their mouth. This is all the sucking, the biting, the chewing. Obviously, we know that children have teeth coming in and they're trying to relieve the pressure of that. And that's how they discover things, right? Yeah, they put them in their hands, but most of the time it's putting it in their mouth. So Freud would say that the pleasure center is in the mouth here. This is what he called the oral stage. And if you were if that was where your jam was and you were your psychic energy was fixed in this oral stage and you never really got over it, then these are the people that, when you get older, that are stuck in this stage are going to be the ones that are overeaters because they're putting food in their mouth, maybe smokers, people that put, that chew tobacco, right? People that put cigarettes in their mouth that are smokers, chain smokers, right? It's fixated on putting something in your mouth, whether it's food, whether it's cigarettes, whatever it is. Gum chewers that excessively chew gum. He would say that they were fixated. That's where their energy was stayed, was in this oral stage. Between a year and a half to 3 years old was what Freud called the anal stage, because this is the time when people would start training their children on controlling their bladder and bowels and teaching them how to use the bathroom. So in this case, the pleasure focuses on their own ability to control their bowels and their bladder, to control their pee and poop. And so what Freud said is it's basically the only thing they can control at this stage, and it's about coping with their demands. Do I have control over my own body or not? So Freud called this the anal stage. If you've ever heard the term for somebody who is very neat and tidy and has to have things in a very in an order, then yes, you would be stuck in the anal stage. So if you've ever heard the term anal retentive, it's somebody who needs control, somebody who is very clean and organized and has to have control over their environment. Freud would say that your psychic energy got stuck in the anal stage. From the time of 3 to 6 years old, the pleasure zone is children discovering their genitals. And everything sort of revolves around that. So in this case, Freud would say that you were coping with these incestuous sexual feelings. So a lot of times when Freud talked about relationships of people to their parents, to their brothers and sisters, especially their parents, he would say that as a child, you can't tell the difference between love and sexual energy. And because your identity of who you are is developing with you during this phallic stage, there's no difference in love of a parent and love of a partner, basically. So these incestuous sexual feelings, most of the time, Freud said that boys were competing with their dads for the love of mom, and girls were competing with their mom for the love of dad. Daddy's little girl, mama's boy, those types of things. So this is where a couple of terms that you may be familiar with or you may have never heard before come into play. One of them is called the Oedipus complex. And Oedipus is an old Greek tragedy where this guy, Oedipus, goes to the oracle, which is the old Greek psychic, and says, "What is my fate?" And the oracle says that the fate of Oedipus is that he will marry his mother and kill his father. And he says, that's ridiculous. Fast forward to the end. I wouldn't say spoiler alert because it's like thousands of years old, this story. So I don't have to qualify that with spoiler alert. But he ends up in battle with another person in, armor. can't see their face or anything like that, and it ends up being his dad. He ends up killing this person in battle, and he ends up marrying his mom. So Freud ran with that analogy and said that little boys have sexual feelings of love towards their mother and a little bit of hate towards their father, because their father takes mom's attention and love, takes her, right? So that's called the Oedipal complex. So he said that little boys stuck in the phallic stage are coping with that. And so sort of sexual misconduct and things like this, mistreating a significant other, a partner, a spouse, may have to do with being stuck in the phallic stage. These jealousy and all of that stuff, right? For women, he called it the Electra complex, and it worked pretty much the same thing. Electra would be women who, or little girls who have sexual feelings towards their father and compete and hatred towards their mother. So it's basically the same thing, but from the female perspective. Freud would also say that Freud was one of the first people to talk about the instances of homosexuality not coming from families where there was not a strong same-sex role model. Maybe boys became gay because there wasn't a father in the house and they were raised by a mother, and things like that. Again, I told you guys this is out there, but these are the things that he came up with that set the stage for what we now call clinical psychology. So from 6 to about puberty, he called it the latency period, where this is the phase where they have developed their sexual feelings, and they're just trying to figure out what they are. And once puberty hits, for the rest of your life, he called that the genital stage, where you're just maturing. You figured out what it is that you like and don't like is in terms of sexual interests, and you are just maturing those interests and figuring out exactly what it is. So those are the psychosexual stages. In addition to that, Freud said, well, we know that the angel and the devil on your shoulder, the id and the superego, don't necessarily get along. And sometimes that's going to be a problem, because if they clash, right, like I said, if the ego can't play referee well enough, then they cause problems in the way that you think and problems in your personality. And so sometimes things happen, like we get into traumatic accidents, we witness something that we shouldn't. And so not only is the ego trying to keep peace between your angel and devil on your shoulder, but the ego is also, according to Freud, trying to protect you from things that may cause harm later on. In fact, the ego is responsible for taking things that might be traumatic or taking things that might be inappropriate and doing us the favor of pushing them down into the id. I kind of liken it to sweeping some of our, dirty laundry, sweeping some of our excess dirt under the rug in the area underneath where we can't get to it. So in addition to trying to keep the peace between the id and the superego, it also tries to shove things down into the unconscious mind that it doesn't think our mind can handle. So when it does this, it doesn't ever want those things to surface again, right? If we were the victims of some sort of assault, if there was a car accident and it was very traumatic to us. So the ego tries to send it away. And also, if any part of it comes back, it tries to protect itself with tactics that try to reduce and redirect anxiety, sometimes by distorting reality. And that's sort of what Freud called a defense mechanism. So what he said is that these defense mechanisms, if anything ever comes up, we kind of deflect it or distort it so that it doesn't affect us later. We don't want to be fragile later in life, more than we already are, which, is a good idea in theory, right? So in this, repression is this idea that underlies all of our defense mechanisms. Our ego takes something that's unacceptable, some sort of thought, some desire, some memory that we've had, some experience, and it tries to shove it under the rug, right? In this case, so that we never have to live it again, so that our ego can be protected and we don't get all worked up and go crazy, right? So repression underlies all other defense mechanisms. It's sometimes incomplete because we get little blips of things that come up that may trigger us, and or that it comes out in times that we can't control, right? So we can't access our unconscious mind, we can't control it. But what Freud said is there are two ways that the unconscious mind may come out. One, he was a big believer in dreams. Remember, we talked about this in chapter 3, so I'm bringing chapter 3 back. In dreams, we may be getting glimpses from our id that are coming up and sort of projecting into our dreams. So if we dream something inappropriate, or if we dream about symbols like things that look phallic, like cigars or bananas or things like that, that's a interpretation of a sexual desire, or things like that. So he was very big on symbolism in dreams coming from the unconscious parts, from the id. Or you may have heard the term Freudian slip. A Freudian slip is a slip of the tongue where when you are talking, Freud says it's the id, the unconscious part of the mind, that's slipping in. You're not just misspeaking, it's the id that's coming in and sort of redirecting your tongue in this case. So what do I mean by Freudian slip? Well, if you'll allow me to be a little bit inappropriate here, and you can't stop me because I'm recording, let's just say that one day, you and some coworkers or whatever, I know this is not in these times, you wouldn't go to a restaurant, but let's just say that you, back in the day, right, decided that you really liked hot wings and you really had a hanger-in for wings, and the closest wing place that was actually fairly tasty, even though you didn't want to admit it out loud, was the establishment that we know as Hooters. Hooters, although they're known for their wings, of course, is also known for something else. They're known for their servers, who may have ample assets, shall we say, and they dress a little risque or scantily clad, if you will. And so you're there with your coworkers, could be male and female. I don't discriminate, of course. And you're there waiting, and you see that this one waitress in particular is doing a really good job, being very attentive, bringing out extra ranch when, not even when asked for it, or anything like that. And when that table leaves, you're hoping that that waitress comes to you. She also may happen to have a lot of features that people who frequent Hooters like. So let's just say that she's, doing a really great job serving and being attentive and things like that. And you're looking at her go, and you see the other table leave, and they leave a lot of money on the table for her to pick up because, they're showing her she did a really good job. So you turn to your coworker and you're like, wow, look at that waitress. I hope we get that one. She got really good tips. She has really big tips. Look at the table that just left a lot of cash for her. So you didn't mean to be inappropriate and use a euphemism for breasts, but it slipped out, even though that's not what you meant. And so what Freud would say is that's a little piece of your id coming through into consciousness and making its way to show you that you were not necessarily concentrating on her ability to serve. So that's what I mean. I'm going to give you, in the links with this chapter, I'm going to give you a list of Freudian slips. So let's see what the internet has to offer besides that one, because that one, sorry if it's offensive. So there are, besides repression, so repression is the one where you're basically pushing everything down and protecting yourself by pushing it down into the deep, dark depths of the id. Hopefully never to resurface again. Of course, Freud would say you can't really help it if it's a slip of the tongue, Freudian slip, or if it comes out in your dreams. And yes, those dreams have meanings. In modern day, we say, well, can't you just interpret a dream however you want? Does it have to have a specific meaning? That's personal interpretation, I think. So what are these other defense mechanisms that basically go along with repression? Well, the first one we'll talk about is called regression. If you've ever noticed somebody that is acting like a child, if they're throwing a tantrum, even adults, I don't know, like the president, and they are retreating to a more infantile stage, right? So Freud would say that they're going back and reverting to an earlier psychosexual stage. Remember, we just talked about those: the oral stage, the anal stage, phallic, latent, and genital stages. So if we look at the behavior, right? Children, let's say it's the first day of a new school. It's the first day of first grade or second grade or something like that. And all of a sudden, the child in the back seat is like, I don't want to go to school. I'm scared. And so they will latch on to mom or dad, or maybe they'll even go back and revert to something they did when they were 3, which was sucking their thumb, right? Or before that, right? So of course, Freud would say that's part of the oral stage, because not only are they putting weird things in their mouth, but their thumbs, right? Thumb sucking is pleasure centers in the mouth, so you're sucking on the thumb. So a child going to kindergarten or first grade in a new school, kind of scared the first day of class, and so they're latching onto their parents like they did when they were little, or they start sucking their thumb again. Freud said that you are escaping to a more infantile and earlier psychosexual stage to make you feel comfortable, right? So Freud called these behaviors regression, a retreat to an earlier developmental stage. We see this in the animal kingdom in monkeys like orangutans, chimpanzees sometimes, and of course in humans. So what are the sort of 6 most well-known defense mechanisms? Here we have a nice little table for you to study, but I will go over this with you. Of course, remember that all of these other ones underlie the big one, which is repression. So repression would be banishing these anxiety-arousing impulses and pushing them down into the deep, dark depths of your unconscious mind. And when that happens, it leaves way for, if there is any chance of bringing this up in a dream or of it coming up again, because repression is never a complete throwaway. Sometimes these things manifest themselves. They show up a little bit. And so we need a way to the ego needs a way to deal with these things. And so Freud said that these defense mechanisms are the way to do it. So again, we just went over regression, and I'm going to give you an example of it. And then I'll talk about the other 5 well-known defense mechanisms. So regression is a retreat to a more infantile psychosexual stage where some of this psychic energy again remains fixated. So in this case, a little boy reverts to the oral comfort of thumb sucking in the car on the way to his first day of school, even though he may not have been a thumb sucker for a couple years now. Reaction formation is one that we see when people switch their impulses to the absolute opposite of what it is. So if you're really mad at somebody, like a neighbor, and you're in a dispute, you go completely the opposite direction. And even though you're really mad at them, you give them, cookies, bake them cookies and give them to them behind a fake smile, and do exactly the opposite of how you feel. In modern day, you've probably heard the term passive aggressive. This would be the old version of Freud's idea of a passive aggressive person. So reaction formation would be switching unacceptable impulses into their opposites. So you're repressing any angry feelings towards someone, and in response, you're going to do exactly the opposite. You're going to display exaggerated friendliness. Here, have some cookies I baked for you, right? Projection is one that we see a lot, also in the president. Disguising one's own threatening impulses by attributing them to other people. So there is a saying in El Salvador that the thief thinks everyone else is a thief. There is a couple of famous courtroom movies where one says, I'm not out of order, you're out of order. The whole courtroom's out of order. So basically, it's, I'm not crazy, everybody's crazy except me. I'm the only sane one. That's where this idea of projection comes from, disguising your own threatening impulses and attributing them to other people. When we talked about in chapter 13 the idea of cognitive dissonance, which came 50 years or more after Freud. Freud came up with the defense mechanism of rationalization. This is sort of what we talked about in social psychology, the idea behind it with cognitive dissonance, right? If you have that tension between how you think and how you're acting, that you have a natural tendency to want to reduce that tension by trying to rationalize it, right? You tell yourself, I don't want to get up to go to the gym every day, but I should be in, for my health, for my weight, whatever it is, right? I don't want to go to school every day, but you're sticking with it because you know it'll get you ahead in life, right? You're rationalizing it to yourself. So Freud says offering a self-justifying explanation in place of a real, more threatening unconscious reason for one's actions. So if I'm out here during this pandemic and I'm drinking every day, I don't drink every day, but I have been having cocktails a little more than I would normally do on a regular basis. Not to the point of excess. And trust me, I know about addiction. So a habitual drinker says she drinks with her friends. Oh, just being social. I'm not actually, drinking because I like the alcohol, but everybody else is drinking and I want to be part of this. So they're giving a rational, what they think is rational to their own mind, explanation. Oh, I only ate these Pop-Tarts because I was just being social, not because I really, have no control over it, right? That's the idea of rationalization. Displacement is one that I can relate to. And that is, and a lot of people can relate to, is shifting sexual or aggressive impulses toward a more acceptable or less threatening object or person. So getting back from work and being in a bad mood and taking it out on your roommate, or taking it out on, a significant other comes home, they're upset about what happened at work, so they start yelling at their spouse or their kid, and taking it out on a less threatening object because they can't yell at their boss at work. The example here, a little girl kicks the family dog. She's playing with her food or talking back at dinner time, and mom and dad say, go to your room, you get no dessert, you don't even get to finish your meal. The little girl's really mad, so on her way to her room, she can't, again, talk back to her parents, so she kicks the dog. I was, it reminds me when I was about 11 or 12, I got invited to do a market research discussion panel thing, and I think they were going to pay me $50. And, when I was 11 or 12, it was like 1990. Yeah, I know I'm old. Leave me alone. And I really was I needed a ride because I couldn't get there myself. It was in Santa Monica, and I lived about 7 or 8 miles away. And so I told my dad, I'm like, hey, you got to drive me to this thing. And he was being very lazy and wanting to just relax on his chair. And I was getting really frustrated, and I was kicking the ball to my dog, who loved chasing a tennis ball in the house, out of the house, whatever. And so I was like, Dad, come on, please. I need to get there. I want my $50. I'm not going to ask you for $50. This is money that, that you don't have to give me. All you got to do is drive me there and then pick me up after. And so I was kicking and I was waiting, and he was just being stubborn and lazy. And at one point I missed the ball in frustration and kicked the wall. So I was trying to take it out on the dog's ball and kick it harder and harder while I was frustrated. And I ended up kicking my foot against the wall, and I believe I fractured or broke my second toe. And so I had to be on crutches for a couple weeks. That was a lot of fun. That's displacement. And the last one is straight up denial. Denial is refusing to believe or even perceive some sort of painful reality. So the example given here is that a partner denies a loved one's affair, even if there's evidence. Text messages in a cell phone or pictures or things like that. They're like, no. They're just probably having, a work meeting or something. Maybe they're planning something for me. He or she could not be cheating on me. That can't be real. And you're just straight up refusing to believe it because that helps you deal with it better. So these are the defense mechanisms that Freud came up with. And we can see examples of these in real life. So, you know, other than the being in love with your parents and psychosexual stages and the unconscious mind being unable to be um, accessed, some of these things, you know, are not too far-fetched. Some of them really are out in left field, right? So, um, what happened to Freud's theories? Because the other thing that we found out as we got really a lot more technologically advanced and better at being able to research things like this is that they found out that it was hard to be able to research something that you couldn't scientifically get evidence for. How do you measure an unconscious mind that you have no access to, right? So we'll get to that in a sec. But looking at Freud's ideas, of course, he had students and people who were very interested in his theories that he taught his theories to. And these, the hope was that these people could take his theories and run with them towards the future of psychology. So the new direction and the new people that he bestowed his knowledge to were called Neo-Freudians. And so the Neo-Freudians were the people that learned from Freud because they were really interested in this idea of clinical psychology, and they wanted to take it to modern times. So they accepted many of Freud's ideas, but they realized that some of them might be a little far-fetched. So whereas Freud said that basically everything that happened to you was a result of your relationship with your parents and sexual energy and all of this stuff, what about the fact that we compare ourselves to other people? What about others that influence us besides our parents? We have many family members, many friends, teachers, right? Things like that that really have an influence on our lives. And Freud argued, no, your personality comes from your parents and your relationship with them and really not anything else, which didn't seem like necessarily the right idea to everybody. So the Neo-Freudians, the new ones that took his theory and ran with it in the next generation, they placed more emphasis on the conscious mind, saying it's not just, it can't be just 20% of how we operate. And they also tried to place more motives on social things like comparing yourselves to others, peer pressure, stuff like that, rather than just rely on everything being about sex and aggression, right? So in the modern day now, what we know is that psychodynamic theories are still around, but not necessarily in exactly the same way that Freud talked about them. So people today that run with these psychodynamic theories are rejecting Freud's emphasis that everything is based on sexual motivation. And that their view of the unconscious and mental life is primarily unconscious, which is more in line with what Freud was saying, except not in the same way that he talked about the unconscious. Now they incorporate the unconscious mind that we have been talking about, implicit thoughts and memories, classically conditioned, primed things, right? That's how we think of mental life and being unconscious, not a cesspool for these unacceptable thoughts and feelings that are just shoved down in the basement with no key that's locked away. Freud said that how you basically develop your personality early in life with that influence of your parents and your id and all of that. So they do contend that social experiences influence adult personality, sometimes attachment patterns, if you are the quintessential mama's boy or daddy's girl or things like that, or how attached you are to your significant other in a relationship, and that it's more social experiences rather than just how your relationship with your parents was. And some of them believe that the way that we act or the way that our personality is formed is based on why we see different specific types, right? Why I would have had you guys do these personality trait listings and talking about things that you guys have in common is because some believe that there is the shared evolutionary history of humans shapes the fact that we have some universal predispositions. So some of these words that you use to describe yourself, some of these personality traits that people have, are universal based on archetypes. And that was a man named Carl Jung, as we'll talk about. So some of these Neo-Freudians, Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, and Carl Jung, took Freud's ideas as the basis for their teachings and the basis for their research and their contributions to psychology, but they turned the corner and sort of made them a little more modernized. And as they did that, they sort of went away from Freud a bit and brought this idea of psychodynamic theory into the future. In 1932, you can see there was a woman named Karen Horney who was very ahead of her time as far as feminist psychology goes. What she brought to the table was the fact that she refuted Freud's idea of he had talked about something in addition to the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex, that he said that a lot of times, remember this is when men were in the workforce and women stayed home and took care of the kids and didn't really work on their own. So he said that women, because men had all the control, that women had this repressed feeling of something that he called penis envy, which meant that they were envious of men, their ability to, you know, maybe pee wherever they wanted, and that they had the control and the power based on that. So he said that a lot of women suffered from penis envy, wishing that they had the power and control from the male side of things. And what Horney said is that men were really the ones that were sort of insecure, and that they would make women feel low and lower their self-esteem so that those women wouldn't leave them. So here we see a quote from Horney saying, "The view that women are infantile and emotional creatures," right? This is still, even when Hillary ran for president in 2016, this was something that people said, oh, well, don't, if it's that time of the month, don't let her get near the button or she'll just push it out of anger. And, she can't control her emotions. So Horney was way ahead of this in the 1930s. It said, "The view that women are infantile and emotional creatures, and as such incapable of responsibility and independence, is the work of the masculine tendency to lower women's self-respect." And she was right on in this case. Horney was also one of the first to bring this new thing, which is still around in the modern day, and it's a very big portion of psychology, called self-help. That recognizing that you may not necessarily need a professional and that there are certain things you can do, breathing exercise, stuff like that, basically stuff you can do to help yourself. So she sort of started that movement as well. Alfred Adler was a man that looked more at social issues than relationships with your parents, because Adler talked about how people get anxious and neurotic, being able to when they compare themselves to others. So it's very much a social thing and not just did your parents approve of you or not, right? Because Freud was all about the relationship between children and their parents, but Adler said things like, the individual feels at home in life and feels his existence to be worthwhile just so far as he is useful to others and is overcoming feelings of inferiority, feeling that people are better than you, or that you're worse than others, or that you're not capable of doing the things in this world that other people are capable of doing. So that is definitely a social issue, right? You're not saying that, oh, I'm not good enough because my parents said that. You're saying that, oh, Johnny over there has a good job and has a good degree and a family, and here I am, I'm the same age as Johnny and I have none of those things, and blah, blah, blah. So as long as you're, dealing with those feelings of inferiority, which he also coined the term inferiority complex, showed that this was much more right when in bringing it into modern day in the 1960s, that this was a lot more than just your relationship with your parents. And Carl Jung, who was probably Freud's favorite and most famous disciple, they eventually did not see eye to eye as Carl Jung kept developing his theories, and they had a falling out later on. But Carl Jung said that the unconscious mind is not just a cesspool of unacceptable thoughts, feelings, desires, wishes, but that this idea of an unconscious, he called it the collective unconscious. Um, and from that, is not just the bad stuff, but like, what about things that we think about that have never existed before? People that write books and stories from scratch, people that invent new things that have never been seen before, right? Like the person who invented the microwave. So he says that the unconscious mind is not just a place for bad, unacceptable things, but that we have a collective unconscious, and that's where creativity comes from. So from the living fountain of instinct flows everything that is creative. Hence, the unconscious mind is the very source of the creative impulse. So he says that we have what's called the collective unconscious, and Jung talked about these universal archetypes of personality coming from this idea of a collective unconscious. Not only is it an area where maybe the bad things are sort of thrown into, but it's also a good place from where creativity flows. And Freud did not see it that way, so they butted heads later on. So now at this point, you may say, oh, well, we saw something called, in these list of terms that you didn't go over yet, called free association. And you talked about this unconscious mind and the fact that we, as individuals, could not access this unconscious mind. But yet Freud made a living of seeing these people. So first of all, let me go back to this idea of Freud. Freud said mental health is different from physical health. And if you're having a problem adjusting, if you're having these neuroses, anxieties, what we now call depression, these things, come see me and I'll get to it. And so the question is, how was Freud able to access things in your unconscious mind when you couldn't, other than dreams and maybe an occasional slip of the tongue? Well, Freud used what he called projective tests, which is a personality test that provides some sort of ambiguous stimulus, so a picture or a word or something like that, that's designed to trigger the projection of a person's inner dynamics from the id, from the unconscious mind, to reveal their unconscious motives. So going back to this idea of free association, if Freud were to say the word mom, and he would say, just tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. So it's the unconscious, like snap of a finger, first thing that comes to your mind when you hear this. Let's play word free association, mom. And if you were to say love, okay, well, that shows your inner dynamics are all about love for mom. But there may be a chance where, he says, oh, mother, and the first thing that comes out without you even consciously thinking about it is bitch, right? Uh-oh. That says that your unconscious mind has some strong feelings there, and that word association or other using other projective tests was the way to take something that's ambiguous and reveal the inner workings of the id, of the unconscious mind. A lot of times, psychodynamic psychologists use what's called a TAT, or thematic apperception test. A thematic apperception test is a projective test in which people express their inner feelings and interests through stories they make up. So basically, I would show you a picture of, let's say, a restaurant, right? That might trigger some feelings now since we can't go to restaurants at the moment. But let's just say in normal times, I showed you a picture of a restaurant, and maybe there's a couple closest to the picture here, and they are, the couple is, sitting down, having, just they're looking at each other. Maybe there's a conversation, maybe not. You see a cook behind the counter, other people dining at this restaurant. And so I were to show you this. There's nothing necessarily good happening. There's nothing necessarily bad happening. That's what we mean by ambiguous. It could be good or bad, or we don't know. It's kind of, you give it your own spin. So showing you the picture and telling me, all right, tell me what's happening in this picture. Again, don't think about it. Just the first thing that comes to mind, boom, tell me what's going on. So if the person says something like, oh, this couple, has been wanting to go out on a date for a while, but they have young kids, and demanding jobs and all of this, and they're just happy to be out and, just enjoying each other's company and being able to have a meal away from the house for the first time in a while, and it's just kind of nice. Okay, well, that reveals your inner workings, kind of peaceful, things like that. Or this couple is on the verge of, somebody might say this couple's on the verge of divorce or breakup, and they're really, not trying to blow up at each other in a public place. And the guy thinks that the cook spit in his food, and he's asking to take it back and make a new one. And, right, things like that would reveal the nastier, darker side of your inner dynamics. So that's, instead of using words, would be using a picture, and based on the interpretation of that picture, that's what they would perceive. And so this would be a way of saying, oh, there's what your unconscious mind is revealing. The, of course, most widely used one is something that most of you probably have already heard about, called a Rorschach test. And the Rorschach test is basically was made up by a man, and I'll show you, the video that goes with this from Crash Course Psychology, because you guys have gotten pretty familiar with that guy over the last few weeks. Herman Rorschach decided he wanted to get in on this game. So he made these ink blots on one side of the paper, and then he folded the other side over, and they basically look like mirror images here. And in this, he would say, instead of an actual theme or a word, he would say, look at this ink blot and tell me what your inner mind thinks that it is. So by looking at this, if you look at the picture on the left, oftentimes I ask people in class what this looked like, and I get a lot of different answers, right? Again, I want the first thing that comes to your mind. So some say two warriors facing off in a battle. Some people say two people about to kiss. Some people say it looks like a pelvis, like on an x-ray. Some people say it looks like some sort of animal, right? And so this is sort of the most widely used, still to this day, most widely used projective tests. And it's usually a set of about 10 of these that were designed by Rorschach. And it's the same idea of this free association, of this first thing that comes to mind, bringing up your unconscious inner dynamics, right? So it seeks to identify people's inner feelings by analyzing interpretations of the blot. Is this something evil and dark? Is this something nice, like two people dancing or kissing? Is this something completely out of left field, like, a bear doing blah, 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 right? So this is the one that's probably used the most today. Freud would have probably really liked that. But sometimes, our interpretation of things does not necessarily reveal our inner motives, right? That would be one of the main arguments. So when we are trying to look at all of these ideas that Freud had coming out of left field, everything is impinged upon by your parents and your sexual energy towards them and all of this. And I warned you guys, this was very out there, but this was Freud, right? What we know about research today is that it contradicts many of Freud's ideas, and a lot of them are contradicted because you can't test for these things. If Freud just came up with this idea, oh, well, yeah, the unconscious mind is just locked away from all reality and locked away from our conscious thoughts, how are you going to be able to research that? And the short answer is you can't. So one thing we know in modern day that sort of refutes or contradicts a lot of Freud's ideas is that he said that our development was where we were fixated from childhood, and that we're not developing anymore as that. Who you are as a child and the things that happen to you are basically how you live your life as an adult. Well, in modern research, we know that development is lifelong. You may have core personality traits that come from a young age or even at birth, but development is lifelong. People can change the way that they act, their personalities, at least a little bit over their lifetime. In Freud's world, everything was about parental influence and nothing was about other influences. So we know that with Freud, parental influence was definitely overestimated, and the influence of others, like your peers, right? Inferiority complex, comparing them to others, neuroses, things like that. Peer influence was very underestimated. Freud didn't even think about
others, right? Maybe he didn't have enough friends. All I know with Freud is if I was around in his time, I'd want to give him a hug and say, who hurt you? What did your parents do to you for you to come up with all of these grandiose ideas? Anyways, I'm diverting. I digress. The Oedipus complex and Electra complex have been questioned because, again, borrowing from Greek tragedy and running with it is one thing, but to think that everything focuses on your parents, that's a little bit much. Freud talked about things like gender identity and sexuality. And what we know now in modern day is that gender identity develops much earlier than Freud theorized, right? In that sort of latency stage or even before the phallic stage. And again, that it's possible without the influence of a same-sex parent. So Freud would say, that homosexual tendencies, gay tendencies, would be because of the lack of a strong role model or same-sex parent influence. And we know that this is not true. The belief that dreams disguise and fulfill wishes is disputed. Remember that wish fulfillment theory was only one of 5 for dream theories, and some people are still big proponents of dreams being having interpretations and things like that. But it's a very big dispute because dreams can be interpreted, again, any way they want. Just like the idea that some sort of suppressed sexuality is what causes psychological disorders. The fact that people want to be a certain way and can't, and that gets pushed down into the unconscious mind, and then it develops as some sort of psychological disorder. So we know that Freud's idea there was a little, shall we say, left of center. His scientific methodology is criticized because there's no scientific methodology. It's all from the mind of Freud. He was the first one to come up with it, so he didn't feel like he needed to prove it. And if he did, there was really no way to prove it. And when Freud tried to get an idea of what was happening with people, he was the first one to try to make diagnoses in clinical psychology. He listened to people's free associations, whether it was a picture or whether it was words or however he did it. He gave them explanations after the fact, and most of the time, these after the fact explanations failed to predict behaviors, failed to predict traits, failed to comply with or to be in line with the pattern that the person came to him with. So his explanations and his ideas didn't necessarily match. Now, of course, this was before we had a diagnosis book and understood sort of the treatment and the prognosis of these disorders. But yeah, it didn't seem to go the way that he wanted. So things were definitely askew. Things were definitely not right with Freud's theories. That's why the Neo-Freudians sort of went in their own direction to try to bring it more into modern times, less away from sexual and parental influence and more towards social issues in society. But Freud is still the poster child, right? For the most part. Freud is still the poster child for modern psychology. And why is that? Because he was the first one to bring it to our attention. So although most of his ideas are really out there, as we've just discovered, Freud is still credited with being the first person to recognize that mental health is separate from physical health. And that's a huge, huge accomplishment in this world, right? He was credited with drawing attention to the fact that we have an unconscious portion of our mind. Before that, nobody even thought about it in that way. Maybe Wilhelm Wundt a little bit when he started psychology, but he didn't run with it. He was more about perfecting the research side of things to figure out what makes us tick. Freud was the first one to say, hey, when things are not balanced, we've got mental problems that don't have anything to do with our body, with physical things that you'd go to a doctor for. So he drew attention to the unconscious, although it may not be the way that, again, it's not today seen the way that he saw it. We do have a big portion of our mental life that's unconscious. He is credited with the fact of he's the first one to bring to people's attention that, yeah, people did struggle to cope with their own sexuality. We still see this today. And of course, the refusal to believe that it's a choice, that it's inbred and that it's not a choice, I was going to say. that being gay or bisexual or whatever it is not something that you're choosing to do just to get, mess with society or something like that. So there's a lot of people that are struggling to cope with sexuality, and he was the first one to really bring it to people's attention. And what about this idea, right? 50 years or more before cognitive dissonance, Freud was the first one to address that there is a conflict between what we want in society, our biological needs, sex, aggression, things that we want, and our social restraints. We can't just beat somebody up and take their stuff, right? That's frowned upon. That could get you put in jail, even though we may want what they have. I want that person's TV, but I can't just go in and take it and hurt them. So he was the first one to show that there's a conflict between our biological urges and the fact that in society we can't do those things, right? Social restraints. And of course, he identified those forms of defense mechanisms and sometimes what are called unconscious terror management defenses, rationalizing, right? And those other defense mechanisms, regression, repression, projection, right? Reaction formation, all of those things. And again, even though they may not all be exactly the way that he described them, we see a lot of these things. We see the thumb sucking and hanging on to mom when the kid is scared in regression. We see rationalization, right? Now it's more, we talk about it in that idea of cognitive dissonance, where we're trying to release some of that tension between how we think and how we act. So some of this stuff is there, right? He had sort of the beginning workings of some of this stuff. So he does deserve credit for it. It's just that most of it came not exactly the way that it really is today. But I mean, give the dude credit. He came up with all of this from scratch. So, of course, in modern day, research does not support many of his ideas because they can't be researched. So this idea of repression and throwing things away, not necessarily true. As he said it, we may hide certain things. Again, we talked about in the memory chapter about people that try to recover these so-called repressed memories, and it's probably just more a suggestive technique than anything. Freud's view of the unconscious as this collection of unacceptable thoughts, feelings, wishes, desires, memories, again, not supported because you're not able to look at that scientifically through research. Huge difficulty trying to test his concepts. So he gave us the basis for modern clinical psychology, which we are always grateful for. But a lot of the ways that he saw things were way out there, shall we say. When we think of the unconscious mind today, again, in modern day, and still a lot of psychodynamic theorists exist that may use ink blot tests and a free association of words and the thematic apperception test, the TAT. But when we think about how the automatic unconscious brain works now, it's more about information processing on an easy level so that we have our attention and conscious mind free to think about other things and learn other things and do other things that occurs without awareness. So breathing on our own so that we can do everything else. Our unconscious mind is in control of breathing and heartbeat and all of this. In today's world, when we think of unconsciousness, we think of schemas, right? Like we talked about in sensation and perception that sort of guide our world. Priming, hemisphere in the right hemisphere activity where we're making inferences, and if somebody tells a joke we can get it because we get the hidden meaning. Implicit memories, emotions, learning, and stereotypes, right, are based on this unconscious brain. Although research does seem to support two of Freud's defense mechanisms more than the others, when there was research run, reaction formation and projection, sort of doing the opposite and thinking that everybody is guilty of it except you, those seem to be the ones that research supports more than any of the others. So there is a little bit that can be shown via research. And some of these you say, okay, I can see where he got that from, and I can see that's a thing. But most of it was just really, really heavily centered on parents and sexual feelings. And again, it just makes me want to say, who hurt you? What did your parents do to you? Are you good? right? Because he was so busy helping everyone else. Who knows? Maybe Freud had a bunch of problems that needed solving, but he couldn't tap into his own mind, right? So that's the end of Freud. And I'm sorry that I can't answer any questions you have about this, but there's always office hours and email and things like that. So when we come back for the second portion of this chapter, of this lecture, of these lectures, we will talk about the other theories that were not Freudian, and bringing us into the modern day of the different ways we can assess personality. So thank you for coming along on this ride, and as always, I will talk to you soon.